I'm Reged Ahmad, coming to you from Gadigal land, and this is The Full Story. Today I'm bringing you an exclusive first look at a Guardian Australia investigative podcast we've been working on for months. It's about billionaire Gina Rinehart. Let's have a bit of a listen before we speak to our lead investigative journalist behind it.
I want you to imagine it's a warm Perth summer's night. You're on the banks of the Swan River and you look across the water and you see a waterfront mansion with a huge marquee on the lawns. You might hear music floating across the water, or the Perth Lord Mayor, Basil Zempilas, emceeing the event.
It was a very special night, actually.
There are people on horseback, decked out in Dryserbone and Rossi boots, who ride in, waving giant flags. The party's in honour of Gina Rinehart.
And yes, it doubled as a 70th birthday celebration for the current West Australian of the year.
I never picked her to be 70, actually.
In attendance is the opposition leader, Peter Dutton. He'd flown from Canberra to be at the party for just 40 minutes before jumping back on a plane to Melbourne to campaign for a by-election. If you went to the Pilbara, to Gina Rinehart's Roy Hill mine, you'd see that party scene captured in a huge mural on the wall of the reception area. Dutton and Gina are seated side by side, smiling. Gina clasps her hands in joy. Dutton would later say he was proud to be there.
I consider it to be a dear friend, a great Australian, and Australia's most successful businesswoman.
So Gina Rinehart is now the Liberal Party's second biggest donor. The birthday party is just one event that has seen Gina Rinehart cultivate the relationship with Peter Dutton since he became opposition leader in 2022. Just weeks after he assumed the top job, she flew Peter up to Roy Hill on her private jet to see her Pilbara operation. Just 10 days later, he announces a policy aimed at pensioners. It's one that Gina Rinehart has advocated, and it shows their shared vision.
I had a number of discussions with Gina Rinehart, including in relation to I've seen her advocacy of this policy. But
since then, the closeness between the two has only grown. He borrowed her private jet to attend a Sydney event, which he says has saved taxpayer money, and he's been her regular guest of honour. At her National Mining Day speech,
a Dutton coalition government will be the best friend the resource sector in Australia will ever have. I'm keen to rip up as much red and green tape as possible. I want to see more excavators digging, more gas flowing and more trucks moving. We will have your backs and I hope that you'll have ours as well.
He's also recorded messages for her National Agriculture Day.
I'm seeking your support come the next federal election, which will be a battle for the very soul of our nation and for the future of Australia.
With just weeks to go until the federal election, Gina Rinehart is on a mission. I'm Sarah Martin, and from Guardian Australia, this is Gina. I don't think you can do a podcast about Gina Rinehart without coming to the Pilbara. You kind of have to see this to understand her.
The people who we work for when we do Roy Hill works don't say anything negative about her. I mean, Auntie Gina, she looks after me.
Why do you call her Auntie Gina?
Because it's just, I don't know, just like a sign of respect.
An endearing term, yeah.
This is a series about power, privilege and influence that asks, who is Gina Rinehart?
She introduced herself as Gina Rinehart, that little voice. Mining magnate. She has turned herself into a global figure.
And what does she want?
Gina Rinehart has watched what's happened in the US in relation to how the billionaires have sucked up to Donald Trump and become part of his inner circle. I think Gina wants to do the same.
We need a USA-style DOGE, Doge, that delivers action, one that helps to return dollars to our pockets and investment back to Australia.
It's really good to be here, isn't it?
Yeah.
To imagine her as a kid playing in the creek, and this would be a pretty incredible place to grow up. But so you'd be so lonely, wouldn't you? Gina Rinehart is a lot of things. She is, by all accounts, Australia's biggest success story.
She is aiming to fulfil her father's dreams, but also more than that.
I mean, nothing succeeds like success, and she did it.
All of that Roy Hill and Hancock empire that we hear about, and all of that iron ore and all of those jobs, she built that.
Yeah.
She did build that.
Yep.
She's also a climate sceptic.
If I may ask a question for students to ask their teachers and do their own independent research, and that is, which comes first, global warming or an increase in carbon?
A Trumpette.
I even have the photograph, I think, of the first night we met, believe it or not. To me, she's sort of like a female Donald Trump.
A litigant.
Nobody wanted to talk about Gina Rinehart. You know, the refrain was something from, no thanks, I don't want to be sued, or no thanks, I don't want to lose my house.
Even against her own kids.
It's all about winning. At no point do we say, well, they are my flesh and blood, and I'm not going down this path.
The woman who saved swimming.
The success that we're seeing and having in the pool right now is massively contributed by her. So without her, we're nothing. So very, very grateful for all she does for us.
She is a person who doesn't shy from a fight.
She was furious.
What does a furious Gina Rinehart look like?
That melodic voice sort of goes up a few, what are they called, octaves or whatever it is, and she gets a very stern look on her face.
But is sensitive about controlling her image.
For a National Gallery to take a painting off the wall because somebody thought it was unflattering would be a very big statement to make against an artist.
Well, Gina doesn't like to be known as the girl who inherited the wealth. That really irks her. She'd like to be known as the woman who built on her father's legacy. This girl from the Pilbara takes on all the boys in the boardroom all around the world and amasses this vast wealth.
This is the story of Australia's richest person.
We've seen this story before. I mean, this is Citizen Kane. There are figures from the Old Testament, figures from Homer. You know, you can change the uniforms, you can change the time stamp. This is an ancient story.
Tracing her route from the Pilbara. Gina's country now.
Yeah, Gina's country, that's her country. Yeah, Gina's country, yeah.
To the corridors of power.
Hi, Sarah. It's so good to see you.
Hi, Reged. It's great to be here.
Now, we've had this intriguing taste of your new investigative podcast, but I want to ask, why did you feel this series needed to be made?
It's a really good question. And I think, to be honest, the more we've gone into it, the more I realised how much we needed to make this series, because I think everyone has really been struck by these scenes of Trump in the White House, but Elon Musk being right there next to him. Really, this has thrust these billionaire operatives into the spotlight, so much so that people are talking about this sort of new era of oligarchy, right? I think what we're seeing in the US is that this is really a moment for billionaires. And Gina Rinehart is arguably Australia's most influential billionaire. She's the wealthiest person in Australia. She's politically active. She's hosting fundraisers for the Liberal Party. She is donating directly to the Liberal Party. She sees that her causes that she's been advocating for a very long time are suddenly the flavour of the month. There was this incredible speech that Gina Rinehart made last year where she says, let's not be frightened to learn from the success of Trump. She says we need to make Australia great again. We need to cut taxes. We need to cut government tape and regulations. We need a USA-style Doge that delivers action. She says, don't be frightened to call for make our bank accounts great again. This is all pretty transparent stuff. It's interesting because she's making these presentations when Peter Dutton and other powerful political players are in the room with her. So there's no doubt about what she wants. The question is, how is she going about trying to influence these outcomes?
We are going to talk more about the politics in a moment, but what struck you most about Gina Rinehart as you were investigating her and making this series?
Wow, that's a big question because so much has struck me about her as we've been investigating this. And it's, I think, probably one of the things that has stood out to me is really this incredible family history of hers. And I have to confess my ignorance at the Lang Hancock story, but really looking at her peculiar childhood, brought up by Lang Hancock, sort of marinating in his right-wing politics and ideology, but also how she learnt from him. She sort of followed this playbook about how to use your power, how to use the media, how to influence to get actual policy outcomes that you want. And I think that's been really fascinating to see that in many ways. I've started to wonder whether she had any sort of choice but to turn out to be the sort of person she is today, because she did have this bizarre childhood with this incredibly powerful father figure. So that has been really interesting to me, and I guess it sort of humanises the story as well.
She's Australia's richest person now. Where does she actually get her wealth from?
Yeah, well, most of her wealth comes from iron ore mining. The Hancock Prospecting is primarily an iron ore miner, and her Roy Hill mega mine up in the Pilbara is a massive operation. Hancock Prospecting made more than $5 billion in profit last year. But since she's amassed this fortune from iron ore mining, she's also got her fingers in a lot of different pies. She's in gas, she's in coal, she's in gold, she's in rare earths, she owns Rossi Boots, she's in agriculture, she's got cattle holdings. When you're worth $40 billion, Reged, you can do a lot of stuff. And she is clearly expanding her empire, not just in Australia, but in other countries around the world.
So she has her finger in many pies by the sounds of it, not just mining.
Not just money. And actually, she also even has meat pies.
Meat pies?
Yeah, she has Wagyu beef. And a lot of her events, she is flogging pies.
I didn't realise that she had this vast empire.
There's this really fascinating cultural element as well, right? Like in purchasing Kidman & Co., in wanting to have the brands Rossi and Dryzerbone in her stable of companies, there's this real sort of nationalistic vibe to it as well. So a really fascinating character, but yes, the wealth sort of begets more wealth. The wealth has enabled her to pick up assets across the various industries and classes all over the world. I guess that tells you about the power of having money. Once you've got it, you can make more.
Okay, so wealth is one thing. How does Gina Rinehart use her wealth outside of her business interests?
It's a really good question, and this is something that we've also been looking at as part of the podcast. We are looking at her philanthropic efforts. We know, for example, she's a big sponsor of sport in Australia, particularly swimming. She's also sponsoring a lot of Olympic sports in the lead up to the Brisbane Olympics and has been doing that for some time. Unsurprisingly, the athletes really like that. She's got a peculiar model for some of the funding of those athletes where her funds go directly to the athletes rather than through one of the managing bodies. We know that she is also a donor to the Liberal Party, and in fact last year was her largest ever donation to the Liberal Party. I think it was more than triple the previous year, more than the previous 8 years combined. And that was across the Queensland, South Australian and Northern Territory branches of the party. She's also been sponsoring fundraisers in the lead up to the election. And she's also known to back the IPA, obviously a conservative think tank. So she is using her money to push political causes as well. And they're obviously political causes that are quite close to her heart. Again, as we've found with this entire podcast series, Reged, the more you look, the more you find there are a million rabbit holes to go down. And, we saw this extraordinary situation where when Gina Rinehart wanted her portrait removed from the National Gallery of Australia, the swimmers whom she sponsored also started writing to the gallery requesting that this portrait be removed because it was disrespectful to Mrs. Rinehart.
So she has a lot of interests and really quite a presence across a lot of elements of Australian society and culture. We're moving closer to a federal election. Peter Dutton is in the running to be Prime Minister. What are her connections to him?
Yes, well, very good question. And this is something that we've been looking at closely.
Since Peter Dutton became opposition leader, Gina Rinehart appears to have been very openly cultivating her relationship with Peter Dutton. In fact, very soon after he was elected opposition leader, Peter Dutton was in Perth and Rinehart took him up to the Pilbara to see the Roy Hill mine on her private jet. And since then, he's been a regular guest of honour at many of her events. They've dined together. She's held various fundraisers for Peter Dutton, both at her Sunshine Beach home near Noosa and also at her Brisbane home. So she is, she's, again, this is not something that's hidden. She's made it quite clear that she's a fan of Peter Dutton. They sing from the same song sheet on a lot of policy issues. For example, Gina Rinehart has been very keen to have a Doge in Australia. Peter Dutton has announced Jacinta Price will operate something very similar to what the Doge is purporting to be doing in the US. And he said at one of Gina Rinehart's events that he will be the best friend the resources sector has ever had.
So they sound quite ideologically aligned, but there's no suggestion of any wrongdoing here. So why does her connection to Peter Dutton matter then?
Well, it matters because we know that they're friends. We know that he listens and values her perspective. He has thanked her numerous times for her advocacy on certain issues, which he says are the issues that many Australians also want him to pursue. So it matters because if Peter Dutton is elected as Prime Minister, we want to know who he's listening to. She has said, so Hancock Prospecting has said that their financial support for the coalition is because they believe that they would be a government better attuned to the concerns of everyday Australians. So it's pretty much, it's out there in the open, but I think because it's out there, because we know that these connections exist, we need to understand better what she actually wants.
So you've given us this clear snapshot of why the politics matters. For the podcast, you and your team travelled far and wide. Was there a most memorable moment for you?
So on the day of the Trump inauguration, when Gina Rinehart was in the US for that event, we were at Mulga Downs Station. And Mulga Downs is this vast pastoral station in the Pilbara. It's close to 1 million acres. The homestead is abandoned, it's all been fenced off, but this is where Gina Rinehart grew up. This is this really incredibly isolated childhood where she was very heavily influenced by her father, Lang Hancock. So to be there on the day that Gina Rinehart's in the US for Donald Trump's inauguration was an incredible sort of juxtaposition. It was a great moment to sort of sit back and consider where this woman came from, and it was right there under our feet, in the Spinifex with nothing around for it's as isolated as you can possibly imagine. There is just nothing as far as the eye can see.
What do you think people are going to get out of listening to this series once they hear it?
I think people will get an understanding of who is Australia's richest person, what drives her, what motivates her, what does she want, and why at this moment do we need to be aware of that.